This is From Now On. I'm Lisa Phillips. Just a heads up, this episode contains discussions of grooming, coercive control, and human trafficking. Some may find it upsetting. We encourage you to take care of yourself. As we bring season 1 to a close, I want to leave you with a truth that's both heartbreaking and urgent. Human trafficking isn't something that happens elsewhere. It's happening right here, right now, in our neighborhoods, on our phones, behind those too good to be true job offers. According to the Global Slavery Index, more than 40 million people worldwide are trapped in modern slavery. 1 in 4 of them are children. You've heard me share pieces of my story before and how I was brought to Jeffrey Epstein's island. Stepping off that boat, I saw a young girl whose face I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't until 15 years later that I learned she was Virginia Giuffre. Virginia's courage to speak out changed everything for so many survivors. Yet the trafficking she endured left wounds no amount of money could ever heal. It robbed her of her self worth, made her feel as if her body, her very life, was no longer her own. Trafficking destroys futures. It strips people of their dignity, severs bonds of love and trust, and too often leaves survivors with nowhere to turn. In Virginia's case, the abuse followed her like a shadow through a marriage that should have been her refuge, a husband who promised safety but delivered betrayal, even turning her own children against her. In the end, without the family support and loving partnerships we all deserve, Virginia felt there was nothing left to live for. I will truly miss her, but I will honor her by always supporting survivors and their stories and allowing the truth to be told. So today, I dedicate this final episode of season 1 to Virginia and to every woman who is being trafficked, hidden in plain sight. Think about them. They deserve a chance at a good life. They deserve the support we give to our own sisters, our own daughters, our own friends. These networks of exploitation span from small covert operations in local communities to high profile rings trafficked by wealth and influence, Epstein's, P. Diddy's, or any predator who uses status to enable their crimes. Our goal moving forward must be awareness, educating ourselves about the signs, speaking up when something feels wrong, and demanding accountability for every institution that has failed survivors. Season 1 ends here, but our work is just beginning. Let's make changes, legally, culturally, and personally, to dismantle the systems that allow trafficking to thrive. For Virginia, for the millions who are still trapped, for all of us who refuse to look away. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you in season 2, stronger, louder, and more determined than ever to fight for every survivor's voice. Today's guest is the award-winning international human rights statistician who has developed leading global models to assess risks and vulnerability to modern slavery. Dr. Darana was a founding author of the Global Slavery Index and contributing founding author of the UN's Global Estimates of Modern Slavery. She is the director of Free the Slaves, the oldest anti-trafficking organization in the United States, and is currently working on a book on family court reform for domestic violence survivors and their children. I am so grateful today to welcome back Deina Darana to From Now On. Welcome, Deina.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be back.
I'm excited you're back. So, first episode, we covered your relationship. This time, we're going to cover sex trafficking and your expertise on that. So, tell me, how did you get into the academic side of human trafficking and pursue it as a career?
So, the academic side of human trafficking was actually the least attractive and kind of sexy part of this whole issue area. This was before Taken. So, this was when people still didn't
Mhm.
really know that modern slavery was even happening. They thought it was all white slavery or, Moldovan women that were trafficked into slavery. There was a very low public consciousness about it and was on a mission trip in El Salvador with my church, and we were teaching Spanish and math to like kids in rural San Salvador. And one of the little girls from my community had gone missing. And as you might know, like MS-13 had originated in El Salvador, and
Mhm.
back then it was in the early 2000s. It was a very unsafe place. They've done great work since. It's not really the same now,
Mhm.
but back then it was incredibly unsafe. And we found out that right before we left, that girl had been trafficked by
Oh.
MS-13, and she had actually died. We'd had the funeral and we went to it with the rest of the community, and that really made me deeply affected at that age. I
Mm.
was, a freshman in college. I was, loved the kids that I worked with, and I was like, how can we leave them in such an unsafe situation? Came back to where I was doing undergrad in DC at the George Washington University and started interning for everyone I could on modern slavery. I worked for Amnesty International, I worked for the UN, I worked for Polaris, and I actually was on the National Human Trafficking Hotline and Resource Center for a few years. And I loved the overnight shifts where I was able to talk to victims directly, get them services. It was really eye opening. And what started as an interest in international sex slavery really became a specialization in domestic sex slavery because there just was so much more happening here than I realized. And
Mhm.
luckily, DC happened to be a place that they had centered a lot of that work. As it went on, I noticed that the calls I was getting on the hotline were so different than the way people were talking about sex slavery in policy. They were talking about white female victims of minor victims of sex slavery in America. And the people that I was getting calls from on the hotline were labor trafficking victims or immigrants that were coming or older women who were trafficked or massage parlor brothels and people that didn't have all of this protection because they were immigrants or they
Mm.
weren't native English speakers. And so one thing that really concerned me was how can we make policy that works when we have this idea that we need to protect the wrong
Mm.
populations. Minor children that are American citizens are among the best protected populations in America. You have Amber Alerts when they go missing. People and one thing to remember is that trafficking is a crime, right? Traffickers are entrepreneurs. They're not looking for the path of most resistance.
Mm.
They're looking for where the easiest targets are and the least protections exist. That's not going to be your average American female child that a whole community is going to be up in arms about
Mhm.
missing. That doesn't, of course, mean that sexual assault or kidnap or other things aren't an issue, but trafficking necessarily wouldn't be the commercial benefit there if you were worried about evading police detection.
What is human trafficking in your words?
Yeah, so human trafficking is basically the use of force, fraud, and coercion to exploit someone for labor or sex.
Mhm.
And with minors, you don't need force, fraud, or coercion for the sex component. It's any minor cannot consent under the age of 18 in America. Um, One of the things though that we talk about with sex slavery here and why the academic side was so important is that you have runaway and missing youth, LGBTQ
Mhm.
plus. We have youth in America that are African American girls that are sometimes just characterized as runaways without any real clarity as to what happened. And as I was doing that, I was like, I'm really good at math. It's not something I love doing. I think, at the time it wasn't something I was passionate about pursuing a career in. I wanted to work in slavery, but I saw that the niche the slavery field needed was more data informed science. They needed somebody who could do the statistics and make the policy recommendations that would actually help people. We needed more shelter beds for people that didn't speak English, that had some kind of immigration background. We needed more protections. Like the Department of Labor has a wage and hour division that doesn't ask questions about citizenship when affirming labor standards and helping people out of sex trafficking. That's what we need in a country where immigration policy is so polarizing, and especially now, today, where people are being deported while still being US citizens and
Mhm.
having legal status. I think it's even more important that we have these social protections in place.
Can you explain force, fraud, and coercion in this context?
So, force, fraud, and coercion in this context can look really different, but force is typically what you think of when someone's physically detained. They may be locked in a room, they may be chained to a wall, they may be physically prevented from leaving. Fraud is when you're tricked. You might be signing up for a labor contract as hotel staff, and then you arrive and you find out actually you're meant to be providing sex in a massage parlor brothel. You've been defrauded, but you have very little agency. What are you going to do? You're already here, you have no resources, and you're already indebted to your trafficker, usually for the transportation. So then that's kind of what fraud would look like. And coercion is mostly using threats. So, I would say, like, I'm going to incarcerate your brother for his drug dealing or his gang affiliations if you don't provide commercial sex for me. Some type of inducement to your behavior that wouldn't be normal. Like something like, your dad owes me a debt. So if you provide commercial sex, then we will call that debt even.
Mm.
Your family owes rent, then you're going to provide sex for the rent that's owed. You won't get evicted.
There are a lot of conspiracy theories around human trafficking.
Yeah.
We're still understanding it.
Yeah.
What are the biggest misconceptions or lies around human trafficking?
There are so many conspiracy
Hmm.
theories, and I think they've abounded because it's such an interesting topic and people are universally against it. I think one of the biggest misconceptions we have is that typically trafficking isn't this majorly organized crime. It doesn't have to be in America. We usually refer to it as disorganized crime. So typically these are lower level operators with 4 to 5 women and men that they may control. It's typically not these large sweeping Taken-esque kinds of operations where you have multiple cartels moving people throughout countries. Often it's just not necessary. There are vulnerable populations in every single country that can do this. I think the thing that we miss in a lot of the conspiracy theories is just looking at traffickers as entrepreneurs and like criminal entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
They are going to do whatever it takes to provide the supply of women to the demand that they perceive. If that demand were to shift, that would have a huge impact on the ability and interest of traffickers to be trafficking women. A lot of the work that I do for the US government looks at trafficking rings, like trafficking networks, but traffickers as specifically traffickers of all types of things like wildlife, antiquities, nuclear arms, drugs, and people. It's not necessarily that people are their preferred medium for making money. It just so happens that they're often the most accessible and
Hmm.
low risk to do that. But if we could switch the incentives, make it more difficult to obtain vulnerable people or make it more high risk for them to pursue this behavior, they would switch to something else.
What's the percentage of people trafficked that are women?
So, globally, when we did this research with the Global Slavery Index and the global estimates of modern slavery, it started as high as 71% of all of the people we had found in 2016 were trafficking victims were female. And that number is almost certainly an underestimate because women typically are going to be missing from a ton of like administrative data and research just by nature of how hidden they can be. They're domestic workers who are often largely women. Massage parlor brothels are largely ethnic networks that are highly protected and really difficult to infiltrate. Like we've worked in DC with massage parlor brothel victims
Mm.
who were under the control of their mama sans, which means that they had a cultural tie. They were holding their passports because they're looking out for them in a new country. It's
Mm.
deep levels of manipulation, but it took them years of victim services to even identify that what had happened to them wasn't normal. And so loads of women are conditioned in that way to not come forward. Domestic violence is also very common with domestic servitude. So you're hired to be a nanny or something and you're paid far less than you're entitled to,
Mm.
and that's technically labor trafficking, but if you're already in the home and being abused, there's nothing stopping sexual
Yeah.
assault from occurring as well, and so you see a lot of comorbidity for a lot of these things. I think that you have a huge problem where women especially, there was a report we also issued called Stacked Odds. It was, with Every Woman, Every Child with the UN, and it was a fascinating look at why women are traditionally more vulnerable, and it starts from son preference at, birth, all the way through widows of, men being disinherited or not having the same land tenure rights, and when you look at something like that, you can see how women, especially, what resonated for me was middle-aged women having, all this unpaid household and other emotional labor that they have to provide, which cuts into our earning
Mm.
potential, which then means that we are less secure later on in life.
Mhm.
And those kinds of things can easily lead to financial and other vulnerability factors that then lead to trafficking.
Can you explain why trafficking is a profit driven model?
Absolutely. So, human trafficking is a profit driven model because a core component of a trafficking crime means that it has to be done for economic gain. So, if there were no economic gain or incentive, and it's not always money, it could be any goods and services, right? So it could be rent, it could be drugs, it could be literally anything, smuggling. And it's hard to think of people as commodities in this way, right? So I do appreciate that I'm talking to you, someone who has like such tremendous lived experience, and I am sorry to kind of like depersonalize it in this way, but
Right, yeah, because sometimes it's power.
exactly, it's about power and control, and I think there is something to be said that although academically it's clear that, trafficking can function just like arms or antiquity trafficking or wildlife or any of that, there is something about traffickers' psychology as well that
Mm,
often makes them enjoy the act of trafficking people because of that power and interpersonal connection, and that has more to do with, you know, their crimes. And I suspect that people that are choosing to traffic humans instead of anything else probably have some inner need that's being met that way, some sociopathic and other
mhm,
criminal tendency. And it wouldn't surprise me if they were also rapists and
yeah,
other like child abusers
sadist.
and sadists. Like there's lots of things that go into that. I think talking about it academically has been made it easier for me. So when I was working on the hotline, it became really difficult to connect so deeply and so personally to victims and then to still work in this space. Like I actually wasn't sure I'd be able to handle it. So working on statistics, especially at a global level, made it easier for me to work on policy because it was a step away from the kind of heart-wrenching and
Mm,
vicarious trauma I was
I
experiencing
can't
from
imagine
working
that wouldn't be
directly.
easy to be on those
Absolutely not,
hotlines,
and I
yeah.
know you have so much experience with, like,
Mhm,
vicarious trauma even from the work you do on this podcast. It can
mhm,
really have an effect on your happiness and your ability to keep doing that work. So for me, like, looking at it academically meant that I was able to kind of take myself out of
mm,
the equation and look at the numbers and make the recommendations, and that's been very effective in a policy setting. But then it also becomes very interesting when working with survivors directly because, I've done that a bunch in
yeah,
many of the NGOs I've worked in, and it's fascinating because it reinforces that the models I've built for risk, prevention. I'm a very good vulnerability modeler. That's
mhm,
kind of like my talent here. It becomes so much more important the more I work with survivors directly because I don't know that there's a real path to full restitution. I
yeah,
don't think we're ever the same people we were before.
mm-mm,
And I think the kind of dehumanization that occurs with trafficking is even worse because it is for this economic profit. It's not even because there's some kind of perverted romantic relationship or association. It's typically done because somebody is commodified, and that's a
mhm,
hugely objectifying and harmful experience. And I think when we're talking about how this moves forward, it makes me really happy that I chose to work on risk prevention because I think preventing this, like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I really think it's
yeah,
probably even more so that because how are we ever supposed to be the people we were before?
no, mm-mm. So many different emotions going through,
Absolutely.
the victims, and some of them are beat with so
Hmm.
much physical abuse.
Oh, physical,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, the justice system hasn't caught up.
no,
They require victims to testify against their traffickers. The traffickers often
which is
have it is
re-traumatizing.
so re-traumatizing, and then on top of that, we're not even clear that traffickers will be held
Yeah,
accountable. Like, the justice system just isn't really
mhm,
giving the kinds of sentences that even provide any sort of justice, not restitution, not
right,
revenge, just even justice. And I think we look at the Cassie and Diddy trials, and you look at
mhm,
what she's gone through. There was a clear commercial relationship. He was in a position of power and authority. He was clearly coercing her into those freak off and
yeah,
other sexual activities and into subversive activities that she clearly didn't consent to. She was having negative health implications.
right,
And she was still being vilified now for coming
mhm.
forward under a subpoena, like under a requirement to testify.
Right, the number one thing is like, "Why didn't you leave?"
Oh, yeah.
It's a huge power dynamic. It's also
Yeah.
her boss, she's under contract.
Mhm.
A lot of times you don't
Absolutely.
look at all the and not even just the things that he's doing or saying to her
Mhm.
to manipulate her mind,
Right.
and people don't understand that coercive control.
No, no, the context was so important, and I'm glad you mentioned the coercive control element because it was her career. I mean,
Yeah,
this was P. Diddy. I mean, he was a
mhm,
hugely important, relatively speaking, in her industry and in general, a hugely important figure, and she would have had so much less power, and that's exactly why he did it, because
yeah,
he could, right? And
mhm,
that's kind of
'cause he
the
could.
same in any sphere, right? Anyone with a relative amount of power can use it to
Mhm,
abuse vulnerable people.
mhm. Yeah, prey on the ambition.
Yeah.
You are an international human rights stats expert. Can you explain how being a mathematician actually helps the effort to end human trafficking?
Statistics is not always the sexiest or most, interesting,
You make it sexy.
sounding. Oh, yeah, thanks. I mean, I love it. I do think it's really helpful because Data represents real people, and I
Mhm.
kind of have always said that, like,
Yeah.
it's not just, numbers on a spreadsheet. That's a person, that's their experiences, that's, their reality. It's just when we're looking at a different scale,
Mhm.
it's, looking like numbers. But for me, applied statistics, which like looks at, statistics in the real world is messy. It's
Mm.
tough. You don't have perfect data, you don't have perfect models, you don't have anything complete. It's really difficult, and it makes it one of the more challenging areas of statistics. And
Mhm.
it makes me so much more excited to try to innovate the math in that area. But it's also been really important because policymakers and even like general populations are more and more data driven. They want
Mm.
to know what
Mhm.
the information is. They don't want your opinion on something if it's based on like one or two stories always. They want to know, well, is it a million people? Is it 5 million people? As if that takes
Mhm.
away from the individual experience, which it
Right.
doesn't. But it does help when you're thinking about how much money are we
Mhm.
giving this country to attack this problem? How many people will be taken out of slavery if that were to happen? And I think that's the really powerful part of math to me and statistics in this space is it gives real power to the
Mhm.
experiences of each of these individual people. Like you may not care or know even about one individual um deep sea slave who's on like a shipping vessel for like 7 years and never comes to port, but when Greenpeace and Minderoo Foundation, when I was working there, were able
Mhm.
to make this argument on their behalf, overnight we were able to get basically with the publishing of the US Department of Labor's forced labor and child labor products list. We were able to get that entire industry overhauled
Right.
because we said all these deep sea fishing products from these specific countries were using deep sea slaves. And so, in that way, looking at the data behind each of these individual people that like amount to this immense number of suffering
Mhm.
led to a policy change. And I think that's been very inspiring for me that the
Mm.
policy has really been responsive to numbers.
So the policies can only be changed once they see the stats of how many victims there actually are. So that would support why survivors need to speak up.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And the more education we do, like your podcast, and having people understand what slavery is, like so many people I've worked with have almost no idea that they're being
Yeah.
manipulated and exploited. Labor
That's the
exploitation is
problem. Most of the
rife.
time, you don't even know until years later.
Absolutely. No, no, absolutely. And the worst part, and one of the things that I think about often is that globally, one
Mhm.
of the major reasons we found for why people stayed in a situation of slavery, like why did they stay? Why didn't they leave? Was withheld wages. And that was kind
Mhm.
of similar for Cassie
Financial
too, because
abuse.
it was like the number of albums she was meant to produce, right? But it
Right.
is financial abuse. And
Mhm.
these people stay in situations of slavery, allowing it to compound, allowing the money they're owed to increase when they never actually will receive it. And the fact that we published that and shared that joint experience among all these people was really helpful to so many survivors
Mhm.
because then they were like, oh, but that's me too. So if I keep staying, I might
Yeah.
actually end up just like everyone else. Like we're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
And I
That's
think
the
that's
most important
beautiful.
thing you just said is they are promised something they actually never receive.
Yes,
I hear that so
absolutely.
often. And
Hmm.
like you said with Cassie as well, she had a 10-album contract.
Yeah.
And I think she got only one.
Yeah.
So she was staying in it because, oh, I was promised another one and
Hmm.
it never happened.
Hmm. Keeping you on the hook is a huge like coercion mechanism.
Oh,
Why
of
wouldn't they if you
course.
have the relative power?
That's all the power.
Hmm. Absolutely.
In what spaces does human trafficking thrive or exist within the US economy?
So, trafficking will always thrive where there's a lack of social safety nets and a lack of oversight. So, when there's more surveillance, for example, there's been a ton of really great press around
Mhm.
Super Bowls, and that's really because of like an increase in demand, right?
Yeah, I was
Tons of,
thinking that.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. When there's more surveillance, you tend to uncover more trafficking.
Right.
Surprise. So, the
And a lot
best
of trafficking happens at these types of games.
exactly,
Mhm.
because you're pulling in the demand, and
Oh,
I think
yeah.
that's really where the key is. It comes down to demand, and that's the truth for labor trafficking as well. If we stop demanding cheaply made goods and labor and we ask about the supply chains, there'll be more of an incentive for companies to clean that up. So I think that's kind
Right.
of an interesting corollary. But in the US, this happens only where there's demand for it, when there's demand for cheap sex, when there's demand for cheap labor. And the literature on sex trafficking has been really interesting over the last like 2 decades, but
Mhm.
one of the most helpful distinctions I've understood is the difference between preferential and opportunistic buyers, and that ties into kind of
Mhm.
supplies. So, let's say you're in Las Vegas on a bachelorette party and you're offered commercial sex. You might not have gone looking for it, but if it was
Mhm.
offered to you, you may take it. That's kind of an opportunistic buyer of sex. Preferential buyers of sex are typically people that want children or want subversive sex or unsafe sex.
Mhm.
They're going to be looking for sex regardless of where they are. And so when you make something more readily available, like in Las Vegas or anywhere
Mhm.
else where there's like a hedonistic kind of like
Mhm.
culture of like lots of, you know, thrill seeking and fun and men sometimes like the Super Bowls or like, Las Vegas in general is kind of like a evergreen
Oh,
environment for
sure.
this.
Mhm.
They're more likely to have opportunistic opportunities for sex. So then people are then exploited there. Preferential buyers of sex are often like pedophiles and different things. Like they're going to exist regardless, but both of them
Mhm.
can be addressed if it's less readily available.
Mhm. So with Jeffrey Epstein in his New York ecosystem of trafficking, he was mostly trafficking models, women in the art world. These were young women who all wanted to make it in some form of the entertainment industry or arts. Are there any stats around trafficking in the entertainment industry that you've uncovered?
Yeah. So one of the biggest problems we have with industries like the arts and things that where the known odds of success are so low
Mhm.
is that predatory men like Jeffrey Epstein can prey upon that and say, I'm a person of influence, I'm a person of connections. If you affiliate with me, you may or may not be able to succeed in this space because it isn't about your individual talent as much as it is about who can help you make these
Right.
connections. And there's even an entire trope in pornographic film industries about like casting couches and like what sexual favors can you trade for success in this art industry, like usually it's like movie casting,
Oh, for
and it's
sure. Yeah.
and the idea becomes that the problem is there aren't enough structural protections in industries where labor exploitation is so rife. So industries like entertainment where so many people want to be a part of this, have so much latent talent, but there's so many less opportunities than
Mhm.
there are people. Many people are willing to take on riskier and riskier options to try to make their breakouts in these areas, also knowing that it's often time limited, which adds a huge amount of pressure to any of these potential victims because they know that, like, oh, but if I don't make it, before I'm 40, am I going to
Mhm.
make it in this industry? What is it going to look like? And
Mhm.
there's all of these like socialized patriarchal pressures about women's appearances and age and beauty and all of these things that play into it, but absolutely in industries like that, and there are a couple, I mean, there aren't many that are as focused on physical beauty
Mhm.
as, of course, the entertainment industries are, or the odds are actually increasingly worse for, success because it's so rare to get like those breakout stars.
Mhm.
But when you have a situation like this that's structurally rife for exploitation, it's pretty common that almost like 80% of people that enter these industries are going to face, if not labor exploitation, at least 80%. I mean,
Mhm.
it could,
At some point, for
yeah,
sure.
at some point, it's much likely very, very much higher because how many people aren't taking jobs as extras or
Oh,
prop
yeah.
people or anything for very minimal pay just for exposure? And that's where this really like predatory sense of like do anything for the big break
Mhm.
comes in, and that's when people are really at risk. I mean, it comes in a little bit abroad, but very
Yeah,
bad
I was gonna
here.
say, and also because they know that if I don't take this opportunity, I may
Mhm.
never get it,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
So it's like it's dangled in front of you.
absolutely. And
Yeah,
and you
and that's
know
why I
that
said it's always the ambitious, that
yes.
ambition that they prey on.
And that's it. It's not the weakest people. These are people that are willing to take chances. They're willing to risk everything for their dreams. They're incredibly admirable. And it even happens that way globally, where tons of the people we see that are being trafficked from like poorer countries like throughout Africa or the Middle East into like Europe, they're not the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor are worried about survival. These are people with like college educations that believe that they can actually make it, and these offers are legitimate, and then when they get there, they have
Mhm.
very few options to return. So it is almost always like the victims aren't people that are like foolish or weak. They're often really ambitious and brave and willing to take these extreme chances to have the life that they deserve.
Well, like I always say, when you're up against a master manipulator, you
Mhm.
always lose.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're weak. It's
Mhm.
like you have no idea that the person that you're talking to intentions aren't real.
Absolutely. And that's
How
often
would
the
you know?
case.
Because you
No.
can talk to someone else and their intentions are real, or they want to help you, or just introduce you to someone. Because,
Yeah.
in this business, everything's kind of a give and take. It's
Mhm.
relationship building,
Yeah.
networking. So, how do you know the difference between this person and usually the person who wants to traffic you is very charming
Yeah.
and believable, So
Mhm.
that's the scary part.
And they probably are more successful because of that. I think
Mhm.
the other issue is that you have, as you mentioned, these people that are at inherent disadvantage because they want to take that chance. And the problem is, like you said, if they don't take the chance, they may never get it again. And it's a really
Yeah.
common pattern. Like it happens globally, it happens domestically. I think it's a sad thing. The only thing that would save that is if our enforcement mechanisms and the structural protections in place could actually intervene.
Right.
Then, if they intervene in a timely manner that wasn't disproportionately burdensome to the victims, these people would be less likely to do that, but that's just not the
Mhm.
situation we operate in.
Yeah, and then what do you know sometimes when you're 19 years old like
No.
Cassie and it's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, I'm thinking, Sean Combs is the only way that I'm gonna become a star." No, she probably could have done it many other ways,
Yeah.
because a lot of times they see the beautiful talent and they just wanna suppress you
Yeah.
and hurt you and minimize, your potential
Yeah, of
and get
course.
caught up in that. How do you figure out when you're up against people like that, those red flags to look out for?
And Cassie's example is extremely problematic because she had a contract. This
Yeah,
wasn't some under the table, like, you scratch my back, I scratch your
um,
back. This was a
she had
contract
a
that she
contract, yeah.
was allegedly protected by. And normally, if we were talking about anyone else, I would say get the contract, get the legal labor
Yeah.
protection, get something that you can take back to court. That really didn't save her in this scenario. So I think it's just the
That's a big sex trafficking ring
oh,
that,
yeah.
like, Epstein and Diddy is
Mhm.
bringing in these women for. But let's talk about the ones that are, aren't famous.
Yeah.
There's so many sex trafficking rings throughout entertainment,
Mhm.
arts, sports,
Mhm.
different cities of the US
Mhm.
who don't have that power. They're always promising something to you as well,
Yeah.
but they don't have really probably the means to give it to you.
Absolutely, and they'll
Yeah.
keep you compliant on and that's I mean, the sex component of all of this is also comorbid with all the labor trafficking, right? Like, these people are almost certainly being labor exploited. Like,
Mhm.
think about the semi-pro, football leagues, for
Mhm.
example. I mean, that's an interesting example of extreme labor exploitation. They're being paid minimally for, sporting events that other people are paying to attend, and they're being kept on kind of the wheel like, "Oh, but if you keep doing well here, if you keep
Mhm.
doing this, then you might make it to the pros. You might make it here." And I mean, it's that kind of carrot that you mentioned before that's
Mhm.
constantly being used.
So another way that Jeffrey trafficked young girls was through massage therapy. Why is the massage service industry so ripe for trafficking?
Yeah, the massage parlor industry, but the massage industry in general is a really interesting front for trafficking operations because there's an inherent intimacy to the actual service provision. So there's an unclothed, typically, client, and there's the privacy, the inherent privacy of because they're unclothed, you have like this, closed off space. And so the person that's providing the services is not as protected because it's not as visible. It's not like a nail techs and other people can obviously be exploited for labor as well, but it's less likely that you're going to be exploited for sex in full view of the
Mhm.
potential public. Massage parlors and massage industries are already like, pretty secluded as they were
Behind closed doors.
behind closed doors. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the protections that are federally in place now for massage parlor brothels are no locking doors. There's supposed to be protections about, the standards and like the identification that's used, but really it's an inherently intimate type of
Mhm.
service that's already done in private. And so I think anything that's done in private by necessity could
Mhm.
easily be rife for exploitation for sex.
So who is the most vulnerable and susceptible to trafficking?
Yeah, so I spend so much of my career looking at risk models for who's most vulnerable. And the first model I created was actually about minors in the US and their risk to labor and sex. The biggest risk by far was, aside from like your political status, like your immigration status, was community insecurity, which meant if you came from an area where people were less likely to have any kind of social safety net, like big brothers, big sisters, or just generally people that were invested in your community, if you weren't known, if people
Mm.
didn't know to look out for you or knew who your parents were, knew who your siblings were. And a lot of times that comes down to the quality of the education system, the public education system, because that's kind of like the last fail safe. You're essentially at most risk. If you have the least support, the least financial resources, and you have any kind of immigration or political vulnerability, you face an extremely high risk of exploitation because, like you said, there's this. perception that if I don't take this chance, if I don't take this risk, I'll be one of the many that are deported, one of the many that don't make it.
Mm.
And poverty, first and foremost, typically is the guiding factor there.
So, what are social protections and why are they important to prevent trafficking?
So social protection sometimes looks like I'll give you a great example.
Right.
So I have been a global anti-trafficking expert for almost 20 years.
Hmm.
I lived on the corner in Virginia of this beautiful neighborhood and there was a bus stop. It always struck me as odd that someone could traffic a child waiting at my bus stop
Hmm.
in front of my house just because I didn't know the child, I didn't know their parents, I didn't know who they were supposed to be going with, and they wouldn't necessarily even know me well enough to ask for help. They had
Hmm.
no idea what I was doing. And there's a book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam in academic circles. It's about the social decline in America, about like bowling leagues were like a way that communities could get together. In the age of smartphones and all of this individualized attention, now we're in a place where people really don't know their neighbors. There's not this level of
Hmm.
community connection. And outside of like a school environment, because our children are socializing, really other unaffiliated adults will have no idea how to help or protect, even if they were safe enough to do so.
Hmm.
And so social safety nets typically come in where like community protections can't be financed. So I mentioned I was a volunteer firefighter in our previous session. And as a volunteer firefighter, many firefighters in America are volunteer because like career firefighters are very, very difficult to obtain and they're not well funded. So volunteers supplement many of them. Those types of relationships are people who are taking on positions of public trust to try to be more involved in the community, people that have more to do with like the schools, people that have anything to do with like park spaces and playgrounds. Like these are the kinds of people that are building social safety nets. There's big brothers, big sisters, there's the National Court appointed special advocates, these types of like social community and safety nets, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts of
Hmm.
America, everything that kind of allows adults that are caring and like parents and vetted to have more of a connection. Even youth sports leagues is a
Hmm.
great way to bring people out and get more people involved. It also increases the risk that like children will be exposed to more adults that may not be safe, but it's also probably the only way that more safe adults can be identified for the children
Hmm.
in those situations so that if there is a problem, if there is unhealthy behavior, that it can be found. That's also the case with a lot of the online predation that's happening because when children are online and being groomed or contacted by potential sex traffickers and they don't have safe adults in their space or perhaps their parents
Hmm.
are more conservative and not as they don't have that kind of open dialogue, having other safe adults and people in their lives will be hugely important
Hmm.
in terms of deterring any potential contact.
So, traffickers, they don't work alone, right?
Typically not, yeah.
Yeah. So, like serial predators, they require laborers, loyal friends, customers, enablers.
Mhm.
Is there any research or stats on the ecosystem that are required to have a successful trafficking ring?
So what you really need are recruiters. So those are the people that
Mm.
you often have trafficked, sometimes even trafficked before. They're sometimes called bottoms. So they're the people that you've trafficked the longest that you've then somehow deputized to be kind of like your
Oh.
contact. That happens often in group houses in the foster care system. I've done a ton of work there. So lots of times you might be a trafficker of one girl and posing as her much older boyfriend. And then she's put into the girls, the girls' house, and then she'll recruit
Hmm.
her dorm mates from there to come into your trafficking ring.
You just explained Epstein's trafficking ring.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's kind of the Romeo effect or this like romanticizing a relationship and then having their friends kind of
Yeah.
recruit other friends. Like
Hmm.
that's kind of an easy classic way that traffickers have been doing this. And the recruitment component of trafficking is probably the part that they use aside from the purchasers of the sex, of course. That's probably the largest network they have. And
Yeah.
these are people that are willing to vouch for them. Oh, he's such
Yeah.
a great guy. Oh,
Hmm.
he's whoever he is. He's so successful. He's going to help
Hmm.
you. He's helped all these people. And then, of course, there's the purchasers who are the first and foremost, I want to say responsible party because if they weren't purchasing the sex, there'd be no one to traffic for.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, how can we as parents, aunties, neighbors better protect the kids in our community from human trafficking?
So, because now we're both mothers, so you know
Yes.
how interesting this
Hmm.
question becomes because I spent so much of my career without actually being a mom. And now that I am a mom, I'm
Yeah.
surprised at how much my perspective
Your
changes.
perspective changes immediately.
So much, and I also realized that my answer before may have been something like, "Oh, just befriend the kids in your neighborhood and, like, get to know
Yeah,
them," and now I realize that if some other woman was trying to befriend my daughter, I'd think it was odd.
right.
The clear way to do this is probably to befriend the other parents, and so one of the things
Mhm,
that I've done in all the communities I've lived in is talk to the schools and actually offered, like, stranger danger,
mhm,
workshops because, playgrounds are targeted and oftentimes women are used because we're seen as often like the vast majority of their teachers, their mothers, their safe family members. So if a trafficker is using a woman to
mhm,
get children to come, they'll often come. And I would do this whole thing. I was like, parents, there's no adult that you don't know that's going to need your help for something. Like, we're adults, we can handle it. Don't, like, you don't need to go with them.
right.
You don't need to go look at the animals or anything interesting. There's not something they need your help for. And then if I go to a similar group later and have someone go up and ask them the question, invariably these kids are so sweet and so
Mhm,
innocent. They'll like come and try to help like any random woman. They may be
mhm,
weary of like men because they've been trained and conditioned to
right.
see them as the direct traffickers, but of course it's even more dangerous when they don't expect it to be that way.
Mhm,
So what I would suggest is that as women, support the other women. Like, if
right.
you can socialize with the other moms, the other aunties, and have these types of conversations, or even know who their kids are, like, take an interest in the women you meet at the playground. Like, don't
Mhm,
just sit on your phone anyway, because that's, all of our kids can run off in a second. That's
right.
like just so easy. Practice being present, practice socializing with the other moms,
Mhm,
practice finding things that they like to do and just
right.
like have those organic conversations. But building those community networks of women with women is the best way to
Mhm,
protect our children because you also
mhm,
don't know how many of these women are in situations of domestic violence or unsafe parents and may need that help and
right.
may want to reach out to you.
The American society is way more individualistic than most global societies.
Mhm.
Does that open us up to more risk of human trafficking?
The American society being more individualistic and I would say even a little bit more self-concerned. Like
Right.
we're not as always concerned about our neighbors' welfare as many other societies
Mhm,
are. Certainly does open up our children to higher risk and even our peers because if we see something as someone else's problem, we would never intervene to assist. In fact, there's significant bystander intervention research in criminology that indicates that you are less likely to get help if you yell rape or murder. In fact, the recommendation is that you should yell mom, and most able-bodied
really?
women will come and potentially bring their partners or whoever's with them to help intervene. I mean, and that's a
Mm,
really interesting thing that like mothers and women as mothers are still the caretakers of society.
mm,
And I think that's still true because if as Allegra's my daughter's mom, if
mhm.
I now were to see another 2-year-old or another 10-year-old walking around without their parent or, like, crying or looking lost, my first inclination would be to help them.
Oh, yeah, always.
And I think there
Mhm,
are many times that we underestimate the value of mothers as mothers, but that physical connection we make to children, it doesn't just stop with our kid. Like, we see all children as, like, deserving of that
right,
care and
but things have changed
compassion.
so much where you wanna help that child you see kind of by themselves, but then you're like, "Oh, is this a scam? Is this a setup?"
Yeah, 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 it could
You
be.
start to think that way
Well,
too.
and that's kind of why it's so important to protect yourself first always, but in
Mhm,
the event that you can help, right? Like you see a kid crying, it's and this is a bit different in America because at least in America you could take them to like the front of the store and that they'll have some kind of system for that. You could call
right.
like local law enforcement and do a welfare check on a
Mhm,
kid that you see. You don't even
mhm,
have to get involved directly. But like when you're abroad and you're like, "Oh no," then you could actually you'd have much more of a risk of something like that. And even here you have more protection. It's never fully safe, but I
mhm,
mean, if you see a child and, like, you can ask, it's always worth it. And then, of course, you still can use your judgment if, like, whatever they're asking seems unusual.
right.
But women have a unique power here that I think we haven't really appreciated, that women as moms, women as aunts, women as all of it, we can really regain some of the power we've lost, I think, in our society by banding together.
Mhm. I think it's really important.
Mhm,
What are the ways we can come together from a labor standpoint
mm.
to end human trafficking in the US economy?
Yeah. Labor unions have always been my favorite response to this. That's the case for Thai fishermen, and that is the case for electricians in New York. I think labor unionizing is so important. There should never be ambiguity about what any of your peers or any of your colleagues are being paid. that is an incredible scam that only benefits the corporations that are in charge. It certainly doesn't benefit the workers. And this like imposed secrecy is very unhealthy and very concerning to me. So, like websites like Glassdoor and different things, like we really need way more transparency in order to be able to negotiate effectively. Also, when you have colleagues that are maybe going for your like a promotion to your position, give them a clear understanding of what your earning was. Like,
Mhm.
allow that to be the case because what are you gatekeeping?
Right.
You're gatekeeping your salary so that they could make less. Like there really has to be some concept of a ladder here
Mhm.
where workers understand that we are each other's best
Right.
resources and that the corporations and the leaders of these companies are never going to put our interests above theirs. But labor unions in general with like labor transparency, labor rights, all of that, that is and unionizing can be more formal, or it can even be like collective information and bargaining. Like what is your salary? How do we negotiate that?
So I want to talk about the impact of human trafficking on survivors.
Mm.
Are survivors more susceptible to future abuse?
Unfortunately, survivors are
Mm.
absolutely susceptible to future abuse because first, they've been victimized. So then they have all of this trauma if they have children or other obligations, or they have to be sent back to their home country or make a
Mhm.
home in a new country. They're now
Mm.
in a position of trying to deal with all of these other structural changes, in addition to like sometimes putting their own trauma on the back burner. And then, of course, they're going to be more likely in that compromised situation to be susceptible to domestic violence
Right.
abusers, people that can prey
Mhm.
upon their vulnerabilities, and even being re-trafficked. It's often the case that trafficking survivors get out and then aren't able to stay out of the life
Mm.
because and I mean the life meaning like an exploitative situation like this because
Right.
they don't really have the opportunity to develop other skill sets. They don't
Mhm.
really have the connections and the resources and the community support and they have compounding debt and other issues that are now making them even more vulnerable than they were when they got into the first
And
situation.
yet and you forget that they're taught that they're worthless.
Mhm. Absolutely, the
They Yes, it's
dehumanizing.
the dehumanization
Mhm.
of the way they feel about themselves that puts
Absolutely.
them back into it.
They expect less and less for themselves, and
Yeah.
because they've been used to accepting less and being treated
Mhm.
worse, they believe that they almost they believe that's a norm.
Yeah, that's the cycle of abuse.
Yeah, of
If they
course.
don't go back into human trafficking, they'll usually choose an abuser that makes
Absolutely.
them feel that way,
Absolutely.
until they heal through it.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And that's if they're lucky enough to heal through it
If they're
because who
lucky enough.
knows? Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any information on the physical and mental impact of survivorship?
Yeah, so the physical and mental impact of survivorship is complicated. I mean, there's the physical, I think, and most survivors of any type of
Yeah.
violent crime will agree that the physical harm pales in
Mhm.
comparison, pales to the emotional violence. I think almost, and speaking as a survivor of domestic violence
Right.
myself, I also think that
I
I
can
would
agree
have,
too. Mhm.
exactly, yeah, I would have taken any amount of physical pain to save me the emotional and mental anguish. It
Mhm.
just is not comparable, and the emotional and mental anguish is much harder to heal because
Mhm.
now you have a situation where you're rebuilding your self-worth, as you mentioned, you're
Yeah.
rebuilding your sense of who you are and your independence and your boundaries as you're still in this compromised situation, and so the problem is the compounded abuse by any potential abusers you now encounter, and also it's not even affordable to receive the kinds of therapeutic
Right.
assistance you need in America. It's incredibly expensive.
Incredibly.
Even as a co-parenting, situation, I've had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in therapy and
Mhm.
mediation and all these things, and it almost never can yield what it needs because this is a product of time and growth and change. When you may not have the luxury.
Oh, for sure. And also, even on your path to healing, maybe you get therapy, really good therapy if you can
Yeah.
afford it. But there's also like parents or
Mhm.
family, friends who are still making you feel like everything is your fault. Like, why didn't you leave? And constantly keeping you in this cycle of thinking that things are your fault. So it takes a lot more time if you don't have that support around you,
Absolutely, and that's
which is the
absolutely
most important
true.
part.
Well, and a lot of time people can't understand it, right?
No.
They just can't understand like why did you make these choices? Why didn't you come to us sooner? Why
Yeah.
didn't you do this? And especially for multicultural or
Mhm.
immigrant families, like there's a huge amount of shame
Oh yeah.
and internalized
Mhm.
internalized grief
Right.
over what's occurred and being able to be honest about that is such a hugely important part of your healing journey, but it also sometimes means that you're then isolated further from the people you need.
From the people you really need the most.
Absolutely.
Have you ever worked with any whistleblowers of sex trafficking rings?
Absolutely. Yes. And so whistleblower survivors are fascinating to me because they function within an operation that they want to see fail. So
Wow.
it's almost really interesting because so one of the biggest anti-trafficking networks I've uncovered recently was during my pregnancy in Cyprus. I was able to do this forced surrogacy anti-trafficking thing, and I figured it out because I was pregnant myself and needing an
Mhm.
OBGYN, and there were just way too many in
Mm.
Nicosia, this random small
Oh,
Mediterranean
wow.
country and city had way more OBGYNs than I could find in my area in New York. It was just incomprehensible. And it turned
Mm.
out that because IVF and other things had so many regulations and were so prohibitively expensive in many of our countries, it was Germany, Australia, Ireland, the British Commission, so that's the UK, and the US, you
Mhm.
have and Israel, you have all of these people coming to Cyprus
Oh.
to get, surrogates from the north. It's unregulated and essentially owned by Turkey, and then having those children, brought down to the south where they can then have, citizenship papers transferred to our citi so
Wow,
it
interesting.
was really fascinating,
Mhm.
and it was one of those things that we were when we were looking at it, you're trying to uncover how to best say that these medical procedures, these medical groups are not at the standard they should be, that the people signing the contracts are actually, not getting the protections that they need in place. And then
Mhm.
the whistleblowers in that context were also pregnant women. So they were willing to
Wow.
work with me, but they were terrified. They came for fraudulent universities in the North that didn't exist. And once they got there, they were they had
Really?
very few options other than to be trafficked for, the surrogacy work. And so those whistleblowers were just so incredibly brave and like working with me, another pregnant woman who was also like trying to uncover all this before I gave birth so I could try to like set up some of these protections. I mean, the whistleblowers that actually try to take themselves out, they're so inspiring because often survivors will engage in small acts of sabotage, like whatever they can do to get back at the trafficker with with very little guarantee of protection. Whistleblowers like that are willing to take the whole thing down and often have so much bravery because they have no guarantee that any of these whistleblower protections will actually keep them safe. But they're so invested in justice and seeing it end and other people not being victimized that they do this. So it's actually really fascinating when you think about it that way. And I think the pregnant women in the forced surrogacy ring are a really good example of like you can be tremendously vulnerable. These women were like visibly and physically vulnerable as well, and they were still willing to fight for a better future for their children.
So you're talking about all these women were brought from these different countries to Cyprus
Mhm.
to carry a baby full term,
Well,
and
that's what ended up happening, yeah.
they weren't, being paid for it.
Exactly. Yeah, no. So in the north of Cyprus, the south of Cyprus is kind of what you would think of as like where you might go on vacation. Like it's part of the
Right,
EU,
yes.
it's like a normal place. The
Mhm.
north of Cyprus, the same island, but like a separate territory, is owned by Turkey. And they have these fraudulent universities. So people are attracted to come, but then they get there
Oh.
and there's no university. So these people are like vulnerable and ready to be trafficked. So if they're not trafficked for labor, they're trafficked for sex. They have like traditional brothels there and because the IVF community is, like prohibitively expensive in
Mhm.
other places, these people end up becoming proxies. So there were Georgian women, women from the Ukraine that were white passing. There were women from the Middle East, South Asia,
Mhm.
and Africa that were then just used as like complete surrogates. And like it was a sliding scale based on race. So if you were white passing, they might use your eggs as donors. And if you were not, they would just use the whole product, like the egg and the sperm from the donor parent, and you were just an incubator essentially. And what was really interesting
Wow.
was the medical regulations in the North didn't exist. So even when I was doing my research as a pregnant woman, I couldn't even spend longer than 6 hours in the North because if something happened to me, my baby and I would not be okay because what they would do is they would use Clomid and hyperfertility medication
Mhm.
to have like multiple implantations. Because in normal IVF contracts, you can't guarantee a healthy embryo, but
No.
they could because they didn't care
Yeah,
about
using
the
Clomid can make you have, like, several eggs.
exactly,
Right.
and they didn't care about the health of the surrogates because they were trafficked victims, so they would then
Wow.
selectively abort the fetuses that they didn't want. It was incredibly dangerous and very threatening
Yeah,
to their
that's
lives.
scary. I didn't know
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I uncovered it. It wasn't something that was really, like, even a part of our academic
Mhm.
literature until I happened to be in Cyprus for my own situation and then uncovered it and then managed to come up with all of this before, and get the other embassies involved to preventing it
Mhm.
before I left. Israel and Ireland, and a few others have actually issued reports or like, warnings prohibiting their citizens from engaging in forced surrogacy there because of it.
Wow, that's mind-blowing.
It was really I was especially for someone who'd worked in slavery and seen so many different types globally for so long, it was shocking to me to uncover, like, a new trafficking type and modality, but it just shows that, traffickers are
Yeah,
enterprising.
I'm
They'll
not
really do
surprised.
anything.
Mhm. Big money business.
Yeah, big
Yeah.
money business, huge
Mhm.
amount of money. They were imagine what you would pay, like, in our normal countries for IVF, and then
Yeah,
these
well
girls
mhm.
were being then billed back for their medical visits to
Yeah.
even be putting their own lives there. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, you have to carry a child for 9, 10 months.
Yeah.
So generally, are whistleblowers properly supported when they come forward? I'm just thinking of like Virginia Giuffre, who was the whistleblower for Jeffrey Epstein and the sex trafficking ring.
Honestly, I think most survivors are not supported in the ways that they would need. I think sex trafficking survivors in particular are really misunderstood in terms of how complicated the
Yeah.
abuse is and the commodification of a person. I mean, it really takes a lot out of you.
Mhm.
I don't want to discourage whistleblowers from coming forward because I think there are government agencies and there are individuals and
Mhm.
groups that can protect you. I think nonprofits are doing a great job of that and not putting you at risk until they need to. But as you know, with Virginia, I think the effects of trafficking itself are just so long standing and so difficult to treat
Yeah.
and eradicate that it's always risky business
Mhm.
being a slavery survivor. But I think in this situation, whistleblowers should feel more comfortable now coming forward than they would have 10 years ago. And I think that's only going to keep increasing because trafficking is being really mainstreamed, like law enforcement's understanding, governments are understanding, the UN's understanding. I think there's a much greater likelihood that you'll be supported, but it may still not be everything you need. The use of nonprofit organizations and free mental health assistance whenever you
Mhm.
can is cannot be understated. The
Yeah.
importance can't be understated.
Yeah, things are changing, but it's very slow.
Mhm.
That's the importance of the awareness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And most people don't even understand. Like you're saying modern day slavery. Is that the exact same thing as human trafficking when you say it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. We use the term modern day slavery academically to distinguish between what's happening today and what's been happening since like the end of historical slavery in the U.S. and globally.
Mhm.
Mostly because slavery historically was legally sanctioned, whereas what we would call modern day slavery or
Mhm.
slavery that has always been illegal, like the slavery you'd
Mhm.
encounter with sex trafficking, will never be legal.
Right. What advice do you have for anyone listening who realize they are currently being trafficked or knows of someone who is being trafficked?
So, if you are being trafficked yourself, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is really amazing. They even have a text line that's Be Free. That's where I, like someone like me, answered the calls for most of the time I was in my PhD program. And you'll have really experienced people like helping you to talk about your options, to talk about your assistance. Like domestic violence, it takes many times before people are actually willing to leave or make a move. So be comfortable exploring those options in a safe way. Be careful with what you're browsing. Make sure that your controller doesn't have access to that kind of information. But if you can start talking to those people
Mhm.
about an exit plan, that is
Yeah.
really the best thing you can do because it's going to take a long time for you to get comfortable with the idea of actually executing it. But it's so important to have something like that in place.
What is your hope for the future in the space of human trafficking?
My hope for the future in the space of human trafficking is that we collectively can make it so prohibitively expensive to traffic somebody
Mm.
that it just isn't appealing and it no longer becomes a crime. I think that can happen a few ways. That can happen from us asking more questions of our favorite companies and
Mhm.
supply chains and how much labor is being exploited in these rings. I think it can also happen from societal shifts, like us asking about why we think commodifying sex or commodifying women and anyone is acceptable and starting to have a real cultural shift because the purchasers of sex are our brothers, they're our husbands, they're the people we
Yeah.
know. And if
Mhm.
we can start making those shifts in our own households, in our own communities, in our own societies, I think we can see an end to trafficking.
Where do you think that starts?
I think it starts with literally taking an interest in what the people in your sphere are doing. Are
Mhm.
your brothers going on bachelor parties? If so, what are they doing? Is it
Mhm.
something that they'd be ashamed to talk about? And if so, let's talk about why it's not really appropriate to commodify this woman and think that that doesn't also hurt all women, including their own mothers, their own sisters, their
Right.
own family. And I
Mhm.
think personalizing it that way is probably the only way to do it. Some John schools do a really good job of having, these are sometimes men who are fathers and
Yeah.
having like
Mhm.
their daughter's age come in and talk about the impact of this. Part of it's humanizing, but part of it is also as a community us changing our societal acceptance standards for behavior.
Mhm. I know I've already asked you this, but in the context of human trafficking, when you hear the powerful statement from now on, how would you end this sentence?
It's so interesting because, as I mentioned, I think this is my favorite question that you have. And I've thought about this a lot too, because,
Mhm.
I've been involved in this space for so many points and I've seen so many really great trajections like change
Mhm.
and really exponentially change. Like from no one knowing what trafficking was to now
Right.
like all of
Mhm.
like millions of dollars in anti-trafficking funding and all of this
Right.
research being done. And us even being able to talk about this is really empowering. From now on, what I would like is that we have a standard that changes American society's view of the human worth. That
Mhm.
if we see individual lives as valuable as our own, then it doesn't stand that we can also exploit them for labor or exploit them for sex. And it
Mhm.
almost follows to the same corollary we have to the world I want to see for my daughter. I think
Right.
we
Mhm.
should only accept what we would want for ourselves and our children.
Yeah, to stop it generationally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if that means less convenient clothing
Yeah.
options, if that means, more expensive chocolate, it might mean personal sacrifice,
Right.
but we can speak with our pocketbooks so much stronger
Mhm.
than any policy shift can happen.
Yeah.
Refuse to buy sex,
Right.
refuse to buy trafficked goods. It's really could be
Mhm.
that simple,
Mhm. Yeah. Sounds pretty simple.
right? Yeah. Everyone has to do it though. That's the danger of collective action.
Yeah, and being self-aware.
Exactly.
Right.
And
Mhm.
asking the questions, because
Asking
I mean, the
questions.
Modern Slavery Act
Mhm.
now has all of these companies required to post on their websites about what they're doing. I mean, it's
Mhm.
accessible information. We just have to care.
Yeah, I see little changes happening. A
Yeah,
little change here and there.
exactly.
Yeah. That's where we start, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
This is From Now On. I'm Lisa Phillips, and until next time, stay informed, stay empowered, and remember, there is so much strength in speaking out. And special thanks to our amazing guest, Dr. Davina Dargana. Elizabeth Wyndham is our senior producer, Christopher Leon is the editor, and Jose Oriana is our studio producer. Our theme music is Many Worlds by Memory Theory. If you have any thoughts, questions, or stories about your own views on topics discussed on From Now On, email us at fromnowonpod@gmail.com. And please follow, rate, comment, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If today's conversation resonated with you and you are seeking more support in your own healing journey, if you or someone you know has been sexually assaulted, help is available. Call 800-656-HOPE. If you or someone you know is being trafficked, contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Text 233-733. That's Be Free. PAVE is a 501c3 nonprofit creating a world free from sexual violence and building communities to support survivors. To learn more, go to shatteringthesilence.org. Speak Out, Act, Reclaim, SOAR, is dedicated to providing a safe and empowering space for survivors of sex trafficking to reclaim their stories and stand up for themselves and each other. That's www.speakoutactreclaim.org.